The thermometer outside read 12 below zero. Inside most cabins across the Montana Territory that February morning in 1883, settlers huddled within 3 feet of their fireplaces, wrapped in every blanket they owned, watching their breath form clouds in the air. Children slept 2 and 3 to a bed pressed together for warmth. Water buckets froze solid overnight, despite sitting near the fire. Frost crept across the inside walls in delicate, deadly patterns. But in one cabin 5 miles north of the settlement of Helena, a man sat in his shirt sleeves at a table 15 feet from his fireplace, writing a letter by lamplight. No frost touched his walls, no ice formed in his water bucket. The interior temperature held steady at 43 degrees Fahrenheit, comfortable enough to work without a coat, warm enough to sleep without fear. The difference was 49 degrees Fahrenheit. 49 degrees that separated misery from comfort, suffering from safety. And the man who built this cabin had been called a fool for every single decision that made it possible. His name was Henrik Larsson, a Swedish immigrant who arrived in Montana Territory in 1881. He was 34 years old, a carpenter by trade, and he built his cabin completely wrong. At least that's what every settler who saw it told him. He used the wrong logs, put them in the wrong position, built his walls the wrong way, positioned his fireplace in the wrong place. Even his roof was wrong. The local settlers had watched his construction with a mixture of amusement and pity. Some offered advice, which Henrik politely ignored. Others simply shook their heads and predicted he'd be rebuilding come spring. A few made bets on how quickly he'd freeze out and abandon his claim. No one bet that his cabin would outperform theirs by 49 degrees Fahrenheit. No one imagined that within 2 years, every new cabin built in the Helena Valley would incorporate at least 3 of Henrik's supposedly wrong techniques. And no one expected that his method would spread across the northern territories, changing how settlers approached cabin construction in the coldest regions of the frontier. This is the story of how one man's refusal to follow accepted wisdom created a cabin so superior to standard construction that the difference could be measured not just in comfort, but in literal degrees of warmth. It's about understanding heat transfer at a level most settlers never considered, about combining Old World knowledge with New World materials, and about the courage required to build differently when everyone insists you're building wrong. Henrik Larsson grew up in northern Sweden, in a region where winter temperatures regularly dropped to 30 below zero Fahrenheit, and stayed there for months. His father was a timberman who built houses, barns, and storage buildings. From age 10, Henrik worked alongside him, learning not just how to build, but why structures were built certain ways. In Sweden, they had a saying, "The winter will teach the fool what the master could not." Henrik had seen that truth demonstrated repeatedly. Families who built poorly suffered. Those who built well survived. The difference was not luck, it was knowledge. When Henrik arrived in Montana Territory in the spring of 1881, he came with money saved from 5 years of carpentry work in Chicago. He had $65, a full set of quality tools, and a land claim waiting for him. He also had very specific ideas about how to build in cold country, ideas that immediately put him at odds with local building practices. The standard Montana cabin in 1881 followed patterns established during the gold rush era of the previous 2 decades. Speed mattered more than quality. Adequate mattered more than excellent. The typical design used round logs, 8 to 10 inches in diameter, stacked horizontally with simple notched corners. Gaps between logs were chinked with mud and grass. A single thickness wall, packed earth or rough plank floor, low-pitched sod roof, stone fireplace built against an exterior wall, 1 small window. Total construction time for an experienced builder working alone, 3 to 4 weeks. These cabins worked well enough in moderate conditions. They kept out most of the wind and rain. They provided basic shelter. In a normal Montana winter, with daytime temperatures occasionally rising above freezing and nights dropping to 0 or 10 below. They were adequate. People survived in them. That was the standard. But Henrik had not come to Montana to merely survive. He had come to thrive. And he knew from bitter experience that adequate could become inadequate very quickly when weather turned severe. He'd seen it in Sweden. He'd heard stories from the terrible winter of 1880 to 1881 in Dakota Territory, where hundreds of settlers died in cabins that had been considered adequate. So Henrik designed his cabin using principles he'd learned in Sweden, adapted for Montana materials and conditions. The result was a structure that violated nearly every accepted practice of frontier cabin building. The first wrong decision was his choice of trees. Most settlers cut whatever timber was convenient. Lodgepole pine was common, grew straight, and was easy to work with. Henrik rejected it. He wanted spruce. Specifically, he wanted spruce trees from high elevations where they grew slowly in harsh conditions, producing dense wood with tight growth rings. He spent 2 weeks in July of 1881 hiking into the mountains, marking trees. His neighbors thought this was absurd. Why walk 5 miles into rough country when perfectly good trees stood a half-mile away? Henrik's answer was simple. Better wood makes a better cabin. But that answer didn't satisfy anyone. They thought he was wasting time. The spruce he selected averaged 14 to 16 inches in diameter. Much larger than necessary, his neighbors said. Waste of effort to haul such big logs. Henrik ignored them and began cutting. Each tree was felled, stripped of branches, and left to lie on the ground for 2 weeks. This allowed the sap to settle. Then each log was skidded down to his building site and stacked with spacers, allowing air to circulate. They would dry for 6 weeks before he touched them again. This schedule horrified the local settlers. 6 weeks of drying time? He'd be starting construction in September. Building would extend into October, possibly November. What if winter came early? What if snow started before he finished? Henrik smiled politely and continued his preparations. The second wrong decision was how he prepared the logs. Standard practice was to use round logs, sometimes with a flat surface hewn on the bottom where they rested on the log below. Henrik rejected this entirely. Using a broad axe and a adze, he squared 3 sides of every log, bottom, top, and interior face. The exterior face remained rounded. This was backbreaking work. Each log required hours of careful hewing, swinging a broad axe in controlled strokes to remove wood in precise amounts, using the adze to smooth the surfaces, creating flat planes that would mate tightly with adjacent logs. His neighbors watched this process with amazement bordering on disbelief. James Wheaton, whose cabin stood 2 miles south of Henrik's claim, visited in August and watched Henrik work for an hour before speaking. "You know you're doing the work of 3 men for the result of 1 cabin." Henrik paused, wiped sweat from his forehead. "I am doing the work of 1 man for the result of 1 good cabin, but nobody squares 3 sides, maybe the top and bottom if you're particular, but the inside face, that's hidden. Nobody will ever see it. Why waste the effort? It is not about seeing, it is about fitting. Flat surfaces fit tight. Tight fits mean no gaps. No gaps mean no cold air coming through." Wheaton shook his head. "The chinking takes care of gaps. That's what mud is for." Henrik said nothing. He simply returned to his work. Wheaton rode away, certain he'd just witnessed a man wasting months of labor on unnecessary perfectionism. By mid-September, Henrik had 48 squared logs ready. He began construction. The foundation went down first. Unlike the standard practice of setting cabins on 4 cornerstones, Henrik dug a foundation trench 18 inches deep and filled it with stones, mortared with a mixture of clay, sand, and lime. This continuous foundation extended around the entire perimeter of his planned cabin. This was wrong decision number 3. Foundation work that extensive was for permanent buildings, not frontier cabins. It represented weeks of labor that could have been spent on other tasks. But Henrik wanted no cold air seeping up from below. He wanted no gaps where mice could enter. And he wanted a platform that would not settle unevenly and crack his carefully fitted walls. The foundation rose 1 foot above ground level, creating a raised platform. On this, Henrik laid a floor of split logs, planed smooth on top, fitted tightly together. Unlike the typical packed earth or rough plank floors, Henrik's floor had no gaps, no cracks, no places for cold air to rise through. The floor itself sat on joists that created a 6-inch airspace between the floor and the stone foundation. This air gap, Henrik knew, would provide insulation from the frozen ground below. The walls began rising in late September. This was when Henrik's most controversial decision became visible. He was building his cabin with the logs positioned vertically, not horizontally. This was wrong decision number 4, and it was the one that convinced most of his neighbors that he'd lost his mind. Every cabin in Montana, possibly every cabin in the entire American West, was built with horizontal logs. That was simply how log cabins were built. Logs stacked on top of each other, notched at the corners. This method was so universal that suggesting an alternative seemed absurd. But Henrik had seen vertical log construction in Sweden. Done properly, it had significant advantages. Vertical logs shed water better, with no horizontal joints where moisture could collect. They provided a smooth interior surface. They required no corner notching, and most importantly, they could be fitted with exceptional tightness. Henrik's vertical logs were set into a groove he'd cut into the foundation and were secured at the top into a heavy ridge beam. Each log was squared on 3 sides, remember, which meant when 2 logs stood side by side, the facing surfaces were perfectly flat and could be fitted together with almost no gap. Where tiny gaps remained, Henrik used a technique from Swedish boat building. He cut thin strips of wool felt and tacked them into grooves he'd carved along the edges of each log. When the next log was positioned, it compressed the felt, creating a seal that was both airtight and flexible. The effort required for this method was enormous. Each log had to be positioned individually, lifted into place, checked for plumb, adjusted, secured. The ridge beam had to be exactly level and incredibly strong to support the weight. But the result was a wall with virtually no air gaps. No chinking was needed, no mud, no grass. Just wood fitted to wood with felt compression seals. The settlers who saw this construction shook their heads in amazement. Some rode out just to see the vertical log cabin. They'd heard about it, but had to see it to believe it. Most left convinced it was a colossal waste of effort. A few wondered if, maybe, possibly there was something to it, but none were willing to try it themselves. If you're enjoying this story of forgotten building wisdom, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. We're uncovering the lost knowledge of frontier builders who understood principles that modern construction often overlooks. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next story. Henrik's cabin measured 18 feet by 24 feet, larger than the standard 12 by 16. Another wrong decision. Why build bigger than necessary? Bigger meant more logs, more work, more materials. Henrik's reasoning was characteristically practical. A larger interior meant the living space could be positioned further from the exterior walls, creating a buffer zone where the coldest air would settle. The roof structure was wrong decision number 5. Standard practice was a low-pitched roof, barely steep enough to shed water. Easy to build, required minimal materials. Henrik built a steep-pitched roof, rising 8 feet from the top of the walls to the ridge peak. This created significant attic space. Wasted space, his neighbors said. Why build volume you can't use? Henrik's answer was insulation. The attic space would be filled with materials that trapped air. That air, warmed slightly by heat rising from the living area below, would create an insulating buffer between the living space and the cold roof. The steeper pitch also shed snow more effectively, preventing dangerous accumulation. For the roof itself, Henrik used a technique he'd seen in Swedish barns. He laid split shakes as the base layer, then added a layer of birch bark, then 6 inches of dried moss and grass, then another layer of birch bark, then a final layer of sod. 5 layers instead of 1 or 2. The weight was substantial, requiring heavy rafters and careful engineering. But the insulating value was exceptional. The fireplace was wrong, decision number 6. And it was the one that drew the most criticism. Standard practice was to build the fireplace against an exterior wall, usually the north wall, with the chimney extending up the outside of the cabin. This made construction easier. The mass of the fireplace didn't have to be incorporated into the cabin structure. It simply leaned against it. Henrik rejected this entirely. He positioned his fireplace in the center of the cabin, equidistant from all 4 walls. The structure was massive. He built it from river stones, carefully selected for their flat surfaces and heat-retaining properties. The firebox was large and deep. But the key feature was the mass of stone surrounding the firebox. Henrik built the chimney structure 3 feet thick at the base, tapering to 18 inches at the roofline. This central fireplace was a Swedish design called a kakelugn, though Henrik's version was adapted for wood burning rather than the ceramic tiles used in Sweden. The principle was thermal storage. The massive stone structure absorbed heat from the fire. That heat then radiated into the living space from all sides, 360 degrees of radiant warmth instead of the 180 degrees you got from a wall-mounted fireplace. More importantly, all that stone mass held heat for hours after the fire died down. Henrik could burn a hot fire for 2 to 3 hours, heating the stone thoroughly, then let the fire go to coals or even go out completely. The stone would continue radiating warmth for 8 to 10 hours. This meant he could maintain comfortable temperatures while using far less firewood than a traditional fireplace required. The settlers who saw this central fireplace thought it was the strangest thing Henrik had done. James Wheaton visited again in October and stood staring at the massive stone structure rising in the center of the cabin. That's where your living space should be. You've built a monument to a fireplace and left yourself the edges to live in. Henrik was mortaring stones, he paused to explain. The fireplace gives heat to all the cabin. A fireplace on the wall gives heat to the outside and to the inside. Half is wasted. Here, all heat stays inside. But the space it takes up, you've lost a quarter of your floor area. I have lost no space. I have gained warmth. Space means nothing if you are too cold to use it. Wheaton couldn't argue with the logic, but he couldn't accept it either. It was too different, too foreign. He left shaking his head, more convinced than ever that Henrik was building an elaborate failure. By early November, the basic structure was complete. Henrik had worked through cold October days, through early snow, through wind that made construction difficult. But the vertical log walls were up, the roof was on, the central fireplace stood ready, the cabin was enclosed. Now came the final touches that made Henrik's design unique. He installed 2 small windows, both on the south wall, both with actual glass panes that he'd freighted in from Helena at considerable expense. But Henrik added something no one else did. Inside shutters made from 2 layers of wood with felt padding between them. At night or during severe cold, these shutters could be closed, adding another layer of insulation over the windows. The door was similar. Henrik built it from 2 layers of planks with felt sandwiched between them. Then he constructed a small entry room just inside the door, creating an airlock. You entered the outer door, closed it, then opened the inner door. This prevented cold air from rushing directly into the living space every time someone entered or exited. The interior received the same meticulous attention. Henrik plastered the inside of the vertical log walls with a mixture of clay, sand, and chopped straw. This created a smooth surface, but more importantly, it sealed any minor gaps and added another layer of insulation. The attic space was stuffed with dried moss, grass, and cattail down, creating a thick blanket of trapped air above the living area. By mid-November, Henrik had moved in. His cabin had taken 5 months to build, from June when he started selecting trees until November when he finally slept in the completed structure. Most cabins took 3 to 4 weeks. Henrik's neighbors considered this proof that his method was impractical. Sure, his cabin was tight and solid, but was it worth 5 months of labor? The winter of 1882 to 1883 answered that question. December arrived with unusual cold. Temperatures dropped to 10 below, then 15 below, then 20 below. Snow fell heavily, accumulating to depths of 3 feet. The wind blew constantly, driving the cold through every crack and gap in standard cabin construction. Inside the typical Montana cabin, life became a matter of survival. Settlers moved their activities to within a few feet of the fireplace. They burned wood constantly, feeding the flames hour after hour, trying to maintain bearable temperatures. Even so, frost formed on interior walls. Water froze in buckets overnight. Children developed chilblains from the constant cold. Adults suffered from the same. James Wheaton's cabin was typical. Built the standard way with horizontal logs, mud-chinking, wall-mounted fireplace. James later described his experience in a letter to relatives back east. We lived in a circle of warmth no more than 6 feet across, centered on the fireplace. Beyond that circle, the cold ruled absolutely. I could stand by the fire and feel warmth on my front while my back felt the bite of cold air. At night, we pulled our bed as close to the fireplace as safety allowed and slept under every blanket we owned. Still, we woke shivering. The water bucket, sitting 8 feet from the fire, froze solid every night. I could see my breath in the air, even at midday, with the fire roaring. We burned wood at a rate I had not thought possible. 4 cords of wood that I had expected to last 2 months were gone in 6 weeks. Henrik's experience was entirely different. His cabin, with its vertical log walls, central fireplace, and layers of insulation, created an environment that was genuinely comfortable. He burned a fire each evening, typically for 2 to 3 hours, hot and fast, heating the massive central fireplace thoroughly. Then he would let the fire die down, damper the chimney slightly to prevent heat loss, and go about his evening activities. The temperature inside his cabin would remain in the low 40s, Fahrenheit through the night and into the next day. 40 to 45 degrees, cool by modern standards, but remarkably warm for a frontier cabin in the dead of winter. Warm enough to sleep comfortably under reasonable bedding, warm enough to work on projects without gloves, warm enough that water in buckets did not freeze, warm enough that no frost formed on the walls. The difference was dramatic and measurable. In late January of 1883, a traveling doctor named Samuel Herschel passed through the Helena Valley. Dr. Herschel had a scientific interest in frontier living conditions and carried with him several mercury thermometers. He made a practice of recording temperatures in various cabins he visited. On January 24, 1883, with the outside temperature at 14 degrees below zero Fahrenheit, Dr. Herschel visited 3 cabins in the Helena Valley. The first was James Wheaton's cabin. The thermometer, placed in the center of the cabin about 15 feet from the roaring fireplace, read 7 degrees Fahrenheit, 7 degrees above zero. Inside, with a fire burning, Wheaton sat within 4 feet of the fire, wearing 2 coats. The second cabin belonged to a farmer named Harold Preston, similar construction to Wheaton's. The thermometer in the center of Preston's cabin read 9 degrees Fahrenheit, slightly warmer but still brutally cold. Preston's family of 5 were all crowded onto benches directly in front of their fireplace, the only place that felt even remotely warm. The third cabin was Henrik's. Dr. Herschel entered through the airlock entry and immediately noticed the temperature difference. He placed his thermometer in the center of the cabin, about 12 feet from the fireplace where only coals glowed. The thermometer read 43 degrees Fahrenheit, 43 degrees. Henrik sat at his table, writing. He wore a wool shirt but no coat. Dr. Herschel removed his own heavy coat and sat for half an hour, conducting an interview about the cabin's construction. During that time, the temperature remained steady at 42 to 43 degrees with no active fire burning. Dr. Herschel did the mathematics. Outside temperature 14 below zero. Wheaton's cabin interior 7 above. Difference 21 degrees. Preston's cabin interior 9 above. Difference 23 degrees. Henrik's cabin interior 43 above. Difference 57 degrees. But the more relevant comparison was the interior temperature difference between cabins. Henrik's cabin was 36 degrees warmer than Wheaton's and 34 degrees warmer than Preston's. On average, taking the two standard cabins, Henrik's cabin was 35 degrees warmer. Dr. Herschel later revised his calculations, noting that the comparison should account for the fact that Wheaton and Preston were burning active fires while Henrik's fire had been out for several hours. If you compared the peak warmth in Wheaton's cabin achieved by sitting within 4 feet of a roaring fire, which Wheaton estimated at maybe 50 to 55 degrees, to the general ambient temperature in Henrik's cabin, maintained by stored heat in the fireplace mass, the difference narrowed. But Henrik could also build a roaring fire when he wanted, heating his cabin into the 60s or even 70s Fahrenheit. The practical difference, the one that mattered for daily living, was clear. Standard cabins provided minimal warmth that required constant fire tending and confined residents to a small zone near the fireplace. Henrik's cabin provided genuine comfort throughout the entire interior space with minimal fire maintenance. Word of Dr. Herschel's measurements spread through the Helena Valley. The story was too remarkable not to share. That Swedish fellow who built the strange vertical log cabin with the center fireplace, his cabin was 35 degrees warmer than normal cabins. Some people doubted the report. Others defended it, pointing out that Dr. Herschel was a man of science who had no reason to lie. James Wheaton rode out to Henrik's cabin in early February. He didn't announce his visit, just showed up on a day when the temperature outside was 10 below zero. Henrik invited him in. Wheaton entered through the airlock and stopped just inside the inner door, feeling the temperature difference. He removed his heavy coat, then his second coat. He stood in his wool shirt, the first time he'd been able to do that inside a building in 2 months. "Did you heat the cabin today?" Wheaton asked. "This morning for 2 hours." Henrik gestured to the fireplace where only ash remained. "The fire has been out since before noon." Wheaton looked at the fireplace, at the massive stone structure. He walked around the cabin, feeling the walls, looking at the construction details he'd mocked months earlier. Finally he said, "I owe you an apology. I called your building methods wrong. I said you were wasting time and effort. I was the fool, not you." Henrik shrugged. "You built the way everyone builds. I built a different way. Both are choices. But yours works. Mine." He gestured vaguely toward the south. "Mine is barely adequate. We're surviving, but we're not comfortable. We're not warm. And we're burning wood at a rate that scares me. What if we run out before spring?" Henrik offered coffee. The two men sat at the table in the center of the cabin, 12 feet from the cold fireplace, in 40-degree warmth, and discussed construction techniques. Wheaton asked detailed questions. Why vertical logs? Why the central fireplace? How much did the felt ceiling matter? What about the attic insulation? Henrik answered every question patiently, explaining the principles behind each decision. Heat rises, so you need insulation above. Heat conducts through materials, so you need tight fits and multiple layers. Thermal mass stores heat, so you put mass where it can radiate into your living space. Heat radiates in all directions, so you position your heat source centrally. When Wheaton left, 2 hours later, He carried a sheet of paper with sketches and notes. He had no intention of rebuilding his cabin, but he had 3 friends who were planning to build next spring. He would show them Henrik's methods. They could decide for themselves. By spring of 1883, Henrik's cabin design had become famous throughout the Helena Valley. The winter had been hard, one of the coldest in memory, and everyone who'd struggled through it in standard cabins was ready to consider alternatives. When settlers gathered in Helena for supplies and socializing, the conversation inevitably turned to cabin building, and someone always mentioned the Swedish carpenter whose cabin stayed 49 degrees warmer than normal cabins. The number had grown slightly in the retelling. Dr. Herschel's careful measurements showed 35 degrees average difference, but the peak difference between Henrik's comfortable cabin and the coldest measurements in standard cabins reached 49 degrees. That number stuck. 49 degrees warmer. It was specific enough to sound credible and dramatic enough to matter. That spring, 6 new homesteaders filed claims in the Helena Valley. All 6 visited Henrik's cabin before starting construction. Henrik gave tours, explained his techniques, and offered advice freely. He never charged for his knowledge. He seemed to view it as simply the right thing to do. If someone asked, he answered, "Of the 6 new cabins built in spring and summer of 1883, 4 incorporated vertical log walls. 3 built central fireplaces. All 6 used some form of attic insulation. 2 built double-layer doors with airlocks." The techniques were spreading, adapting, evolving. Not everyone converted to Henrik's methods. Many settlers stuck with traditional horizontal log construction, but even they improved their chinking, added insulation, and paid more attention to heat retention. The standard had shifted. Adequate was no longer acceptable. People wanted warm. Before we continue with how Henrik's techniques spread across the frontier, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. We're sharing stories of ingenious builders who solved problems in ways that are still relevant today. Don't miss out on these fascinating tales of frontier innovation. Henrik himself became a sought-after consultant. Settlers would hire him to advise on their cabin construction or even to build sections that required his specialized skills. He charged fair rates and did quality work. By 1884, he had saved enough money to propose marriage to a woman named Anna Bergstrom, daughter of another Swedish immigrant family who'd settled near Helena. They married in June of 1884, and Anna moved into the cabin that had become famous. She later wrote to her sister back in Minnesota, describing her first winter in Montana. "I had heard stories about Henrik's cabin before I married him. I thought they must be exaggerations. How could one cabin be so much warmer than another? They are all made of logs and have fireplaces." But the stories were true. Our cabin is genuinely comfortable, even in the coldest weather. We live in warmth that my parents' cabin in Minnesota never achieved, and we burn half the firewood they used. The winter of 1883 to 1884 was milder than the previous year, but still cold enough to test cabin construction. The new cabins built with Henrik's techniques performed well. Settlers who had incorporated vertical walls reported significantly less drafting and better heat retention. Those with central fireplaces discovered the joy of radiant warmth filling their entire living space. The attic insulation proved its worth. By 1885, Henrik's methods had spread beyond the Helena Valley. Settlers moving into other parts of Montana carried the knowledge with them. A modified version of his central fireplace design appeared in cabins near Missoula. Vertical log construction showed up in the Bitterroot Valley. The double-door airlock became a standard feature in new construction throughout the Northern Territories. The techniques also evolved and adapted. A builder near Fort Benton combined horizontal log walls with Henrik's central fireplace concept, creating a hybrid design that was easier to build than full vertical logs but still captured the benefit of central thermal mass. Another builder in the Gallatin Valley developed a simpler version of the felt compression seal using wool batting stuffed into grooves, easier to install than Henrik's tacked felt strips. Henrik welcomed these adaptations. He never claimed to have perfect solutions, only better solutions than the standard practice of 1881. As builders experimented and improved on his ideas, he learned from them in return. A continuous exchange of knowledge improved cabin design across the territory. The economic impact of Henrik's methods was significant. A cabin that burned half as much firewood as a standard cabin saved substantial labor. Cutting, splitting, and hauling firewood was dangerous, exhausting work. A settler who could heat his cabin with 4 cords of wood per winter instead of 8 saved perhaps 30 working days of labor. That time could be spent on other productive activities or simply on rest and family life. The health benefits were equally important. Warmer cabins meant fewer cases of pneumonia, frostbite, and cold-related illnesses. Children raised in warm cabins grew healthier and stronger. The psychological benefit of living in genuine comfort rather than constant cold improved mental health and reduced the stress that contributed to frontier life's high rate of depression and anxiety. Henrik's most lasting contribution might have been his willingness to teach. Many skilled craftsmen guard their techniques as trade secrets, but Henrik freely shared everything he knew. He taught other carpenters his hewing methods for squaring logs. He showed settlers how to select stones for fireplace construction. He explained the principles of thermal mass and insulation to anyone who asked. This generosity of spirit multiplied the impact of his innovations. Instead of his techniques dying with him or remaining localized to the Helena Valley, they spread across the northern frontier. By the 1890s, elements of Henrik's design could be found in cabins from Montana to Idaho, from Wyoming to the Dakotas. The vertical log construction technique, though never universal, became known as Swedish style or Scandinavian log building in recognition of its origins. Modern log home builders still use variations of this method, appreciating the tight fits and smooth interior surfaces it provides. The central fireplace concept, adapted in countless ways, became the masonry heater or Finnish-style fireplace that is still built today by specialized craftsmen. Henrik and Anna raised 4 children in the cabin that had been mocked in 1881. As the family grew, they added a room, extending the cabin using the same vertical log technique. The original structure, that 18 by 24-foot cabin with its massive central fireplace, became the core of a larger homestead that eventually included a barn, workshop, and storage buildings. In 1898, a journalist from the Helena Independent newspaper interviewed Henrik for an article about early settlers. The journalist asked about the mockery Henrik had faced when building his cabin. Did it bother you that people called your methods wrong? Henrik, then 51 years old and weathered by 17 Montana winters, considered the question. I understood why they thought I was wrong. I was doing things they had never seen, things that looked like wasted effort. From their experience, I was wrong, but I had different experience. I had seen other ways of building. I knew what worked in cold country, so I built what I knew to be right, and I waited for winter to prove it. The journalist asked if Henrik felt vindicated when his cabin proved superior. Henrik shook his head. Vindication is not important. Warmth is important. I did not build my cabin to prove others wrong. I built it to keep my family warm. If others learned from what I built, that is good. If they still prefer their way, that is their choice. The cabin keeps us warm either way. This pragmatic attitude characterized Henrik's entire approach. He was not interested in being right for the sake of being right. He was interested in results, measurable, practical results, warmth that could be felt, fuel savings that could be counted, comfort that could be experienced. The cabin itself stood for 93 years. Henrik died in 1922 at the age of 75. Anna lived until 1931. Their children maintained the property, and eventually one grandson, Magnus Larsson, inherited the original cabin. Magnus lived there until 1974, when he finally built a modern house with central heating and moved the old cabin's central fireplace stone by stone into the new house's living room. The massive heater became the centerpiece of the new home, continuing to provide radiant warmth to another generation. The vertical log walls were documented before the old cabin was dismantled. Photographs show the tight fit between logs, still sound after 93 years. The felt compression seals had deteriorated, but the wood-to-wood joints remained intact. The structure had suffered minimal settling and showed no signs of the gap opening and chinking failure that plagued standard horizontal log construction. Today, the techniques Henrik brought from Sweden and adapted for Montana can still be seen in high-end log homes and in the revival of traditional Scandinavian building methods. The central masonry heater, in particular, has experienced a renaissance as people rediscover the efficiency and comfort of thermal mass heating. The story of Henrik's cabin offers several lessons that extend beyond building techniques. First, traditional knowledge from one region can often be adapted successfully to new environments. Henrik didn't invent new methods. He applied old Swedish techniques to Montana conditions. This cross-pollination of building traditions created solutions superior to what either tradition offered alone. Second, what appears wasteful in the short term may prove efficient in the long term. Henrik's 5 months of construction seemed excessive compared to the standard 3-week build. But over the cabin's 93-year lifespan, that extra effort paid dividends every single winter. The return on investment was measured not in months, but in decades. Third, mockery and social pressure can be overcome by results. Henrik faced constant criticism during construction, but once winter demonstrated the superiority of his methods, the mockery stopped. Results speak louder than opinions. Building the right way, even when others insist it's wrong, vindicated him more thoroughly than any argument could have. Fourth, sharing knowledge multiplies its impact. Henrik could have kept his technique secret, maintaining a competitive advantage as a builder. Instead, he taught freely, and his methods spread throughout the territory. The resulting improvement in frontier living conditions benefited thousands of people. His generosity created a legacy far larger than his individual work ever could. Finally, true innovation often comes from combining existing knowledge in new ways rather than inventing entirely new methods. Henrik used vertical logs from Sweden, central fireplaces from Scandinavian tradition, and insulation techniques adapted for Montana materials. None of these were new, but their combination was innovative and effective. The 49-degree difference between Henrik's cabin and standard construction was not magic, it was physics. Heat transfer follows predictable rules. Reduce conduction through tight-fitting materials. Minimize convection with proper sealing. Use thermal mass to store and gradually release heat. Insulate to prevent radiation loss. Henrik understood these principles intuitively through experience rather than formal education. He built a structure that worked with these physical laws rather than ignoring them. Modern building science confirms everything Henrik knew. Thermal bridging, R-values, heat capacity, air infiltration. These concepts can be calculated precisely now, but they were just as real in 1881. Henrik didn't need the calculations. He had experience, observation, and the willingness to build differently. The settlers who mocked Henrik's wrong cabin build were not stupid or malicious. They were following accepted practice based on their own experience. Their horizontal log cabins with wall-mounted fireplaces had worked adequately in milder climates and normal winters. They had no reason to believe different methods were necessary until the harsh winter of 1882 to 1883 proved otherwise. Henrik had the advantage of experience in harsher climates. He'd seen what happened when buildings failed. He'd lived through Swedish winters where inadequate construction meant death. He brought that knowledge to Montana and built accordingly. His supposedly wrong methods were actually right for the conditions he knew were possible, even if they hadn't happened in Montana yet. When those conditions arrived, his preparation paid off. 49 degrees of difference, the gap between misery and comfort, between barely surviving and actually thriving, between a cabin that confined you to a small zone near the fire and a cabin where you could move freely throughout the space in genuine warmth. That 49-degree difference changed how an entire region thought about cabin construction. It proved that better methods existed. It demonstrated that the extra effort was worth it. It showed that one person building differently could change community standards if the results were clear enough. The story of Henrik Larsson's cabin is a reminder that the right way and the accepted way are not always the same thing. That traditional doesn't mean optimal, that what everyone does isn't necessarily what you should do, and that sometimes the person everyone thinks is building wrong is actually the only one building right. The cabin stood warm for 93 years. The technique spread across a territory. The knowledge saved countless people from cold and suffering. And it all started with one Swedish carpenter who refused to build the wrong way, even when everyone told him he was wrong. Henrik's legacy lives on not just in the cabins that still use his methods, but in the principle he demonstrated. Build for the worst conditions, not the average conditions. Take the time to do it right. Don't be swayed by mockery or pressure to conform. Trust knowledge over opinion. And when you discover something that works, share it freely so others can benefit. The thermometer outside that February morning in 1883 read 12 below zero. Inside Henrik's cabin, it read 43 above. 49 degrees of difference. 49 degrees of proof that building differently wasn't wrong at all. It was the only right way to build. The story endures because the lesson remains relevant, whether you're building a cabin, starting a business, raising a family, or pursuing any endeavor where conventional wisdom dominates. Henrik's example offers guidance. Understand the principles underlying your work. Learn from diverse sources. Don't mistake popularity for correctness. Be willing to endure mockery for methods you know are sound, and let results speak for themselves. 49 degrees warmer. That's not a small difference. That's the difference between surviving and thriving, between adequate and excellent, between following the crowd and leading the way. Henrik Larsson understood that difference. He built accordingly. And for 93 years, his cabin stood as proof that sometimes the person everyone calls wrong is the only one who's truly right.